On March 28, 1908, William James was born to William and Bertha in East Texas. His mom worked at a major department store, and his dad owned a carnival, complete with a sideshow. As William James grew, even though he only made it to 5 foot 5 inches tall and 135 pounds soaking wet, as he would say, he became a talented athlete and was a curious observer of the world. He also had a bit of a wild streak in him, which is another story for another day. As a young adult, he met Beulah May McNeely, who hitchhiked alone from Virginia to Texas to live with her brothers. Beulah May and William James, who was now going by his middle name, James, married in 1935. And 2 years later, they welcomed James Paulette into the world. Now, at some point in their story together, Beulah began praying that her husband, who owned a restaurant and a bar and had a tough lifestyle, would come to faith. In rural Texas in the 1930s, tent revivals dotted the landscape. These multi-day events had a bit of a carnival feel to them, if you will. A big tent full of folding chairs, a high-energy preacher, talented musicians, singing vibrant music, and crowds of locals gathering to witness and participate in the spectacle. Well, somehow, whether by coincidence or through Beulah's prayers, and she was convinced it was the latter, James found himself attending one of those revivals. Now, maybe it was something the preacher said, or perhaps it was the power of the music or the conviction of all of those who gathered, or the fervent prayers of a beloved spouse. Regardless of the reason, or maybe reasons, James made a decision that night to become a follower of a man named Jesus. And James' life was forever changed then and there. And it wasn't long until James enrolled himself in what was called the Central Bible Institute in Springfield, Missouri, and he moved his small family of 3 there. He was on his way to becoming a Pentecostal preacher in the Assemblies of God denomination. And after completing his training, James moved around the Midwest with his family as a pastor and preacher. He worked in churches in Missouri and Illinois, and he finally found himself here to Indiana. In the 1950s, they found themselves in Marion, Indiana, serving a small church, First Assembly of God, on East 29th Street. Now, this church was directly across the street from the home of Harold and Verlie Walters and their junior high school daughter, Joy Ann. Joy Ann and James Paulette, or Jim, as his friends knew him, took to liking one another, started dating, and eventually got married in June of 1958. They would welcome 3 children into the world within 9 years of being married: Rory Dwayne, Sherry Cosette, and yours truly, Brian Shawn. William James, my paternal grandfather, was my earliest up-close and personal image of what it meant to be a pastor. I watched with curiosity and fascination how he interacted with people, how he prepared for his sermons, and tended to the soul of our family and his own personhood. He loved to spend time outdoors. He was an avid fisherman and hunter, and he was always up for a good game of catch. And some of my fondest memories of him are sharing the pier at the pond by our house, fishing for bluegill and an occasional bass, or of donning baseball gloves and tossing the ball back and forth in my front yard. It was and still is an honor to be Reverend Shivers' grandson. Now, because both of my parents were only children, growing up we spent a lot of time, and I mean a lot of time, with both sets of grandparents. Sunday dinners were a regular occurrence. And my grandpa Shivers and my dad had a way of clearing the kitchen table of all other people when their conversations would inevitably turn toward theology, the Bible, and faith. They would stay there for hours on end, and the rest of the family would joke about it and could sense when it was about to happen. "Here they go again," someone would say, as one by one we got up from the table and went into another room. Eventually, someone would have to remind them that indeed the rest of us were still in the house and that we would like for them to come and join us where we were. But I remember as a teen secretly wanting to stay at the table with them and engage in their conversations. So I would often linger within earshot, overhearing what they were talking about, learning the rhythms of their passions, discovering the way in which their faith informed their daily lives and their ultimate concerns. And by the time I moved here to Indianapolis following college, I'd actually made my way to the table and lived into the conversations by their side. So their legacy is at that table for me. On one afternoon, when I came back to Marion from Indianapolis for a visit, my dad said, "Hey, let's go for a ride." And this was something we would regularly do together, and I seldom knew what our destination was, and it really didn't matter. The important thing was that we were going to be together. Well, this time when we pulled out of the driveway, Dad told me that we were going to go visit Grandpa. Now a widower in his early 90s, Grandpa lived in a retirement center. Dad and I would often go visit him when I came into town for the weekend. Grandpa was sharp and still preached and taught a few times a month until his late 80s. He even did the New York Times crossword puzzle every weekend in pen. But he just didn't have the strength or the energy to do any of that anymore. And it was clear that his health was declining. On the way there, my dad said that he didn't think that Grandpa had much more time with us. And he wanted to visit him together as much as we could, while Granddad still was able to welcome visitors. Now, there was no way for me to know or predict what was about to happen next on what felt like a normal Saturday afternoon. When we arrived, Grandpa was still in bed, and after exchanging hellos and hugs, my dad said, "Dad, you've been a spiritual leader of our family for decades. You have faithfully loved us, taught us, and encouraged us, but we know that you're not likely going to be with us much longer. And I would like to ask a favor of you," he said. "Would you pray over me as I take on this role for the family?" Shocked, I stood there not knowing what to do. I confess I felt like I wasn't supposed to be there for that moment. It felt like I was intruding. It felt like I was a teenager again, trying to overhear the table conversations between my dad and my grandpa without being noticed. Then Grandpa stood up from his bed, and I'm telling you, he seemed like he was a giant, even though he was only 5'5" tall. And he walked over to where my dad was sitting, placed his hands on his head, and prayed a prayer unlike anything I had ever heard. And honestly, I've never heard anything like it since. I can't tell you anything about the words he used in the prayer, but one thing I can say is that room felt like it was full of light. The curtains seemed like burning bushes, and the tile floor felt like holy ground. And when Grandpa finished his prayer, it was as if the room was still aglow, as were our hearts. Something happened there that day, and I've never been the same since. Dad was right. It wasn't long after that until Grandpa died. And that event in his room at the retirement center took on even new meaning for me in his absence. I don't know exactly what happened there, but I do know that I am still formed and informed by it. It is a part of my inheritance from these two men who continue to have a profound effect on my life and my faith. In the two of them, I have an example of what it looks like to live a life in an attempt to follow in the way of Jesus. Neither of them did it perfectly or got it completely right, but they both pursued it as their ultimate goal. That's a big part of my story, of my inheritance of faith. You have them too. I'm sure of it. You have stories of people who have done or continue to do the same for you. People who have left a legacy in your life. People who embody your inheritance of faith through lived and shared stories. A heritage that is found in the lives of neighbors, family members, and friends, each one of them saints who provide inspiration, encouragement, and a living example of what a life of faith might look like. Their presence and their memory provides a mirror of sorts, where you can see reflected in yourself and your own life the same kind of longings, practices, and character traits that you deeply admire in their lives and that you desire to emulate. In our second reading this morning from the letter to the church in Ephesus, the author celebrates the faithfulness of the community and their love for all of the saints. The author writes that it is through the lives of these saints and the presence and power of the promised Holy Spirit that the community comes to know Jesus. And then, with the eyes of their hearts enlightened, they come to the knowledge of what is the hope to which God has called them. And they discover the riches of God's glorious inheritance among the saints, and what is the immeasurable greatness of God's power for us. A glorious inheritance among the saints that lives on in each one of us. We witness this at the font and hear it in the commitments that you as a community of faith make to live and give testimony to the faith for each child and each person whose life is forever marked by the waters of baptism. The legacy lives on at the table, where we are nurtured and nourished together. And our faith stories are told and are connected to the faith stories of those who have left that legacy, a spiritual inheritance for us. It is in the lives of these saints that the eyes of our hearts are enlightened, and we see, we know, we experience the divine. Sometimes inheritance is tangible: an estate, finances, our smile, the way we look, our speech patterns, and even maybe the way we walk. Yet the inheritance that seems to shape our lives the most, the gift given to us from family, friends, and mentors, is found in the intangibles, the way we see the world, the stories we carry with us, and the faith of those who have walked this way before, and as well as those who continue to walk by our side. Their legacy lives in us and is our inheritance of faith. However, it's not just found in the lives of the saints that have gone before us. For friends, it is found in and through us too. It's true that the stories of faith is incomplete without the saints of old, but it is also incomplete without each and every one of you. So today, this first Sunday after All Saints' Day, this All Saints Sunday, we celebrate the lives of all the saints. Saints whose stories we have overheard at the table. Saints who hold our hands, nurture our spirits, encourage our journey, challenge our thoughts, and empower our dreams. Saints who show us the way. Saints who embody what it means to live a life of faith through trials and victories, failures and triumphs. Saints, of which you are one. Saints, just like you. To God be the glory. Amen.